Autopsy report number 348VB was dry and concise, as such documents ought to be. Dr. Ira Michaels, a medical examiner with 20 years of experience, signed it almost without looking, a common occurrence for the resort town of Black Sand. A heart attack in a man in his 50s on the beach. But her hand froze over the line, distinguishing features and anomalies. She pulled back the sheet and looked at the body again. The man was lying on his stomach. His back and the back of his legs were covered with a perfectly even, deep bronze tan. Not just dark skin, but the color of polished old bronze, smooth and unnaturally perfect. But when the orderlies turned the body over, Ira felt an icy lump form in her throat. His chest, stomach, and the inside of his thighs were deathly pale, porcelain cold, like a newborn baby's. The boundary between the bronze and the pallor was so sharp, it seemed as if the body had been glued together from two different parts. There wasn't the slightest sign of sunburn, peeling, or uneven darkening, as if he had lain under the sun exactly until the second his heart stopped beating, and not a second longer. Ira mechanically ran her finger along this boundary. The bronze skin was cold, but to the touch it felt not like skin, but like smooth, polished metal. She jerked her hand back, feeling a sudden, irrational fear. In the anomalies column, she wrote, "Localized hyperpigmented dermatosis of unknown etiology," but deep down she knew it was a lie. This wasn't a medical phenomenon. It was something else. Something ancient and indifferent to human diagnoses. Henry had always been pale. Paleness was his second self. The mark of an office plankton spending his life under the glow of fluorescent lights. Moving to the coastal town of Sunshine Cove was supposed to be his personal liberation. He rented a small house a stone's throw from the ocean, and from day one blocked the huge panoramic window facing the beach. The sun hit it too brightly, too intrusively. He learned about Black's Beach by chance, from the bartender at the local tavern. The Rusty Anchor. The man, grinning into his red beard, said, "People don't go there to get a tan, buddy. They go there to be, but for someone like you, I wouldn't recommend it." The phrase, "someone like you," stuck in Henry like a splinter. Was he like that? Pale, insecure, always trying to fit in. The next morning he went to Black's Beach. The path led down a steep cliff, and when he descended, a strange feeling came over him. The air was thicker, the silence more ringing, and the sun, despite the early hour, beat down with a peculiar, penetrating intensity. The beach was almost empty. A few people lay on the sand, and Henry knew at first glance they weren't tourists. Their bodies weren't just tanned. They were as if carved from old, time-cracked leather, soaked in sun and salt. They moved slowly, smoothly, and their glances, sliding over his pale, clumsy body, were full not of judgment, but of curiosity. As if looking at a strange insect, Henry laid out his bright blue towel away from everyone and lay down, trying to assume the same relaxed pose. The sun burned his skin with unfamiliar cruelty. He felt every ray like a jab from a red-hot needle, but he clenched his teeth. He had to endure. He had to become one of them. He spent 4 hours on the beach until evening, when the sun began to set into the ocean. His back was on fire, but inside him glowed a sense of pride. He had passed the initiation. The first warning sign was waking up in the middle of the night. Henry jumped out of bed with the sensation that he was still lying on the hot sand. The room was immersed in cool gloom. The curtains were drawn, but his back was burning. It wasn't the burn of a sunburn, but a deep, internal heat, as if embers were smoldering under his skin. He turned on the light, went to the bathroom mirror. His back was bright red, inflamed. A normal sunburn, he tried to convince himself, rubbing his skin with a soothing cream. But the cream didn't help. The heat was coming from within. In the morning, expecting to see peeling skin, he froze before the mirror again. The redness had almost gone, but in its place, his skin had acquired an even, unnaturally fast tan. A coppery, dense hue. He touched his shoulder. The sensation was strange. The skin had become smooth like polished wood and almost lacked sensation. He went to the beach again. This time he caught more glances. The old-timers, the leathery ones, watched him more intently. One of them, an ancient old man with a face like a dried pear, sat in the shadow of a rock and watched Henry unwaveringly. His eyes, pale blue, almost faded against his dark skin, were full of a certain ancient sadness. Henry lay there for less than 2 hours. The sun seemed to be absorbed into his skin with greed, but it no longer burned. Instead, it caressed him, and in that caress there was something frightening. The invisible sun inside him responded to the real one, and the heat under his skin flared up with renewed strength. Within 3 days, Henry stopped sweating. He realized this when, walking along the promenade under the scorching noon sun, he felt his body was dry and cool. Or rather, not cool. Cold on the outside, but inside that same fire still burned. His tan had turned from coppery to distinctly bronze. It no longer resembled human skin. It shone with a dull, metallic gleam. When he knocked his knuckles against his chest, it produced a short, hollow sound, like tapping on a hollow metal object. Sensitivity was fading rapidly. He could run a nail over his arm and feel almost nothing, just a slight vibration somewhere deep inside. Panic began to creep up on him. He locked himself at home, drew all the curtains, but it didn't help. The sensation of the invisible sun didn't weaken. It was with him always. In the darkness of the room, his bronze skin faintly glinted like an old coin. He tried to scrub off this layer using a rough washcloth and soap, but the skin wouldn't yield. The washcloth slid over the smooth, glass-like surface, not leaving a scratch. This was no longer a tan. This was a transformation. Despair led him back to the rusty anchor. He hoped to find that same bearded bartender. The man was behind the counter, and his gaze, meeting Henry's, became hard. "I warned you," the bartender said without preamble, sliding a glass of whiskey towards Henry. "What's happening to me?" Henry hissed, and his own voice sounded foreign, muffled to him. "The sun accepted your gift." The bartender darkened. "You came to Black's Beach not to be free. You came to take, to show off, to conquer your paleness. Vanity. The sun hates that." He leaned closer, and Henry smelled the scent of salt and old skin coming from him. There are those who come to the sun with respect, and there are those who come as thieves. The sun punishes thieves. It takes what they so desperately crave. Forever. It's not a curse. It's a boomerang. You wanted the perfect tan so badly? Now it's yours. For eternity. There were a few regulars in the bar. They listened in silence, and in their eyes Henry read not gloating but something worse. Resignation. Resignation to an inexorable law. What should I do? Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. "Nothing." The bartender shook his head. "Wait, the process can't be stopped. You've become part of the beach. It's new landmark. Soon, tourists will be taking pictures with you. They call it bronze disease or sun sculpture." Henry spent his last days in his house, watching as the world slowly drifted away. He couldn't eat. His jaw barely obeyed. His movements became more and more constrained, as if his joints were filling with sand that was gradually turning to cement. He sat for hours in a chair looking at the ocean. His thoughts flowed slower, turning into simpler and simpler forms. Light, heat, weight. One morning he couldn't get out of bed. His legs wouldn't obey. They were cold and immobile, like real metal. Panic, clear and sharp, pierced him for a moment, but then immediately died down, suppressed by the increasing heaviness. He only managed to roll onto his side and hang off the bed, his arm falling helplessly to the floor. His gaze fell on the coffee table, where lay that same local newspaper with the article about the first victim. Now he understood every word. Cardiac arrest wasn't the cause. Cardiac arrest was the consequence. The consequence of the body finally turning into non-living matter. He felt the petrification rising up his stomach, constricting his chest. There was nothing left to breathe with, but the need to breathe disappeared along with the body itself. The last oasis of life was his eyes. He saw a ray of sun breaking through a gap in the curtains. It fell directly on his face, and in that moment, The inner sun that had been burning inside him all these days met the external one. A quiet melodic chime sounded, as if someone had struck a crystal glass. And his vision went out. It didn't turn black. It turned bronze. He saw the world through a thin, impenetrable metallic film. A week later, the landlord remembered him, concerned by his long absence and the smell. Or rather, the complete absence of any smells. Entering the house, he was stunned. On the floor, in an unnatural yet surprisingly picturesque pose, lay a statue. An incredibly realistic sculpture of a man cast in bronze. Every detail was worked with genius precision. The tension in the muscles of the arm fallen to the floor, the slight tilt of the head, the frozen mask of horror and acceptance on the face. The material was cold and perfectly smooth. The police were called. Old protocols were reviewed. Dr. Michaels' note was found. The story gained publicity but quickly died down. The official version was a rare disease causing rapid petrification of tissues. They wanted to send the statue to a museum, but the community of Black's Beach objected. They insisted on their way. Now Henry stands at the edge of the beach on a small stone pedestal, facing the ocean. The locals call him the Eternal Sunbather. Tourists love to take pictures with him, admiring the work of an unknown sculptor. They rub his bronze hand for luck, and over the years the polish has become perfect. Dr. Ira Michaels sometimes comes to the beach at sunset. She looks at the statue and an icy horror pierces her. She remembers that the first victim, and Henry and 2 other victims found in recent years, all had one thing in common. Their bronze skin, it was always cold, but if you touched it on a clear sunny day and held your hand there long enough, a faint, barely perceptible heat began to emanate from beneath the icy surface. As if inside, in the very depths of the metal, that same invisible sun still smoldered, eternal and indifferent. And the most terrible thing was that one day, on a particularly hot afternoon, Ira swore she saw a tiny, transparent droplet roll down the perfectly bronzed cheek of the Eternal Sunbather. A droplet that evaporated before reaching the chin, leaving behind only a ghostly memory of moisture. Or did she just imagine it? She preferred not to check further. Some truths are better left unproven. Of course, here is the continuation of the story, which reveals new layers of horror and introduces a new character confronting the same mystery. 5 years passed. The story of the Eternal Sunbather transformed from a creepy local legend into a popular tourist attraction. Guidebooks listed it as a mysterious sculpture by an unknown author, and enterprising souvenir shop owners sold miniature bronze copies of the statue. For most, Henry was just a successful marketing ploy, a hoax attracting crowds of the curious to Sunshine Cove. But for some, he remained a burning mystery. One such person was Dr. Leo Vander, a young, ambitious biophysicist specializing in anomalous phenomena in living systems. He came to the town under the guise of a vacationer, but his real target was Henry's body, or rather, what it had become. Leo stood before the statue at sunset. The tourists had dispersed, and on the deserted beach remained only him and the silent bronze sentinel. Leo was not a mystic. He believed in data, in measurements, in physics. But looking at the perfect, frozen features of Henry's face, at the expression of frozen horror in his eyes, he felt an icy shiver down his spine. This was not a sculpture. The anatomy was too perfect, too detailed. No artist could replicate the microscopic structure of skin pores or the barely noticeable trace of an old scar on the knee. He took out a portable thermograph. The screen showed what he expected. The statue's body was cold, almost exactly the temperature of the surrounding air. But there were anomalies. Several points on the back and the back of the head weakly but steadily emitted heat. Not diffuse, like from sun-warmed metal, but pinpoint, as if tiny, smoldering energy sources were inside. Leo took the next measurement, a simple conductivity test. When the probes touched the bronze arm, the needle went off the scale. The material conducted electricity as well as pure copper. This completely contradicted his initial hypothesis of some form of rapid petrification, which would yield a dielectric-like stone. "What happened to you?" Leo whispered, putting away the equipment. He turned to the setting sun and felt a heavy gaze upon him, not from the statue, but from someone else. From behind a rock, the same ancient old man that Henry had once seen was watching him. His faded eyes were full not of sadness this time, but of warning. Leo understood he needed access to the medical findings. The official reports were useless, but he learned about Dr. Ira Michaels, the very medical examiner who had signed the first protocol. Finding her wasn't easy. A year ago, she had taken early retirement and lived as a recluse in an old house on the outskirts of town. Ira Michaels didn't want to talk. She looked at Leo for a long time through the door chain, her face haggard and tense. "Leave Dr. Vanda," she said quietly. "Pursue your science somewhere else. Some boxes are better left unopened." "This isn't a box, Dr. Michaels. It's a man," Leo insisted. "Or what's left of him. Science must have answers." "Science has answers to the questions nature asks," she retorted. "But what if the question isn't asked by nature? What if the question is asked by something much older and more indifferent?" In the end, his persistence and professional reputation won out. Ira let him in. Her study was cluttered with books on medicine, but also on mythology, ancient cults, and parapsychology. On the table lay a thick folder labeled Black Speech Case. She showed him what wasn't in the official reports. Photos of the first victim, the one with the perfect tan on his back. Microscope shots of tissue samples she had secretly taken during the autopsy. The skin cells weren't dead in the conventional sense. They weren't decaying. Their structure was altered, the carbon molecules somehow incredibly rearranged, creating a super-dense metal-like lattice, yet retaining traces of the original organic matter. "This isn't petrification," Ira explained, her voice trembling. "It's transmutation. Alchemy performed by solar radiation, but not the kind described in our physics textbooks. The sun at Black's Beach. It's special. It doesn't just shine, it sees, and it judges." She told him about other cases, not in the official statistics. About fishermen who disappeared on calm, clear days, their boats found empty with perfectly tanned life jackets. About locals whose skin grew darker and harder over the years until they walked into the ocean and didn't return, becoming part of the coastal rocks. Henry was just the most vivid example, she concluded. He received a concentrated dose. He was full of vanity and the sun. It feeds on that. It turns desire into physical form. Leo didn't sleep all night, studying the materials from the folder. The rational scientist in him refused to believe in solar consciousness, but the data was undeniable. The substance Henry was made of was unique. It demanded study. His plan was simple and insane. He needed a sample, a tiny fragment. He knew the statue was incredibly hard, but he had a portable laser cutter he used for taking geological samples. At night, under the cover of a thick fog rolling in from the ocean, he sneaked onto the beach. The statue of Henry stood in the milky haze, looking even more ghostly and alive. Leo put on protective goggles, turned on the cutter. A thin beam of bright light hit Henry's bronze wrist, and then something happened that he never expected. The beam didn't burn the surface. It reflected, but not like from a mirror. The laser light scattered, forming a shining halo around the wrist. And at that same moment, Leo felt a searing pain in his own hand. He cried out, threw the cutter aside, and tore off his glove. On his wrist, exactly where he had aimed the beam, a strip of skin was reddening, as from a severe sunburn. He looked up and froze. The fog around the statue parted for a moment, and Leo thought that Henry's head turned, just a millimeter, and his bronze eyes, always looking at the ocean, were now directed straight at him. There was no malice, no pain in them, only a cold, indifferent understanding. Leo started to run. He ran across the wet sand, feeling the burning gaze of the statue and the invisible sun, hidden behind the night clouds, watching him. He understood his mistake. He thought Henry was an object of study, but he was part of a system. The attempt to take a sample was an act of aggression against the system itself, and the system had responded. The next morning, the old man from the beach visited him. He entered the bungalow Leo was renting without knocking. His face showed neither anger nor surprise. "You've had a taste," the old man said. His voice was creaky like an old rope. "Now you're part of the dialogue." "What was that?" Leo asked, showing his burned wrist. "The sun protects its own. You tried to break off a piece. It showed you that it hurts. Not for it, for you." The old man walked to the window, looking towards the beach. "You're a scientist. You look for cause and effect. The cause is disrespect. The effect is transformation. Henry was vain. You are curious. You came not to take, but to know. That's another form of greed. The sun may react differently." "How?" Leo whispered. "It may let you know too much." The old man turned, and his faded eyes seemed to glow from within. "It may make you see the world through its eyes, and you will understand that your science is child's babble compared to the true nature of light. And that knowledge will burn your mind from the inside. Leave before it's too late, before you become the next exhibit. Not a bronze statue, but a living torch, an eternal researcher, burning with the desire to understand what cannot be understood." Leo looked at his notes, at the complex equipment. He thought about the Nobel Prize, about fame, but he also thought about the pain in his wrist and how the statue's head had turned. He remembered Dr. Michael's words. Some boxes are better left unopened. That same day he started packing. His work, his career, it all suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of the ancient, indifferent force that ruled this beach. Before leaving, Leo went to Black's Beach one last time. It was early morning, the sun just rising from the ocean, painting the sky in blood-red tones. The statue of Henry stood in its place, and the first rays of the sun fell on its bronze face, and Leo saw it. The bright sunlight didn't reflect off the smooth surface. It went inside. The statue seemed to flash from within for a moment, becoming almost transparent. Leo saw the ghostly silhouette of a skeleton sealed within the metallic shell, and in the center of the chest cavity pulsed a tiny bright point, like a miniature star. It lasted a fraction of a second. Then everything returned to normal. But Leo understood everything. The process hadn't stopped. It was continuing. The sun hadn't just turned Henry into a statue. It was slowly, over centuries, turning him into something else. Perhaps an energy source, or an antenna, or a seed for something meant to germinate in the distant future. Leo got into his car and drove away from Sunshine Cove without looking back. He never published his research. Sometimes at night he would wake up because his wrist, where the burn was, emitted a weak but persistent heat, and he dreamed that he was standing on a deserted beach, and above him shone not one sun but thousands, large and small, and each one had once been a human who wanted too much. And at Black's Beach life went on as usual. Tourists took pictures with the eternal sunbather. The old-timers silently watched them, and the sun, ancient and all-seeing, continued its silent dialogue with those who were ready to hear it. And it waited for the next guest who would come not for freedom, but with their own insatiable desire.